In the final months and years of World War II, as the tide turned irrevocably against the Axis powers, thousands of soldiers found themselves in impossible situations. Cut off from supply lines, surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces, and with no hope of reinforcement, these units faced a choice: surrender or fight to the last bullet. This is the story of the last stand units of World War II, men who chose to stand their ground when all seemed lost, writing some of the most harrowing chapters of military history. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the jungles of the Pacific, from the deserts of North Africa to the rubble of European cities, we explore the courage, desperation, and tragedy of those who fought until they could fight no more. November 1942. The German Sixth Army, over 250,000 strong, found itself trapped in Stalingrad by a massive Soviet counteroffensive called Operation Uranus. General Friedrich Paulus commanded what had been one of Wehrmacht's most formidable forces, now freezing and starving in the ruins of a devastated city. Hitler's order was absolute: stand fast, no retreat. For 3 months these men fought in temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Celsius, with dwindling ammunition and no winter clothing. They ate their horses, then rats, then anything they could find. The Luftwaffe promised supply drops that never materialized in sufficient quantities. By January 1943, the situation was catastrophic. 90,000 men remained combat effective from the original 250,000. Soviet forces tightened the noose daily, but Hitler forbade surrender. The Sixth Army's last stand at Stalingrad would become the Wehrmacht's greatest defeat, with only 5,000 of those who surrendered ever returning home from Soviet captivity. February 1942, northwest of Moscow. Over 100,000 German soldiers of the Second Corps found themselves completely encircled by Soviet forces in what became known as the Demyansk Pocket. Unlike Stalingrad, this encirclement had a different outcome, one that would tragically influence Hitler's future decisions. For 10 weeks, the Luftwaffe conducted an unprecedented airlift, dropping 65,000 tons of supplies to the trapped forces. The soldiers held their ground against relentless Soviet attacks, fighting from frozen foxholes and makeshift fortifications. They were ordered to hold at all costs, and they did. In April, a relief column broke through and the pocket was relieved. This success convinced Hitler that surrounded armies could survive through air supply alone, a fatal miscalculation he would repeat at Stalingrad with disastrous consequences. The men of Demyansk had fought their last stand and survived, but their victory wrote a doctrine of death for thousands who would come after. January 1944, Ukraine. 2 German corps, approximately 60,000 men, were encircled near the towns of Korsun and Cherkasy by converging Soviet tank armies. The trap closed on January 28th. Hitler again ordered them to hold their positions and await relief. For 2 weeks, these men fought off constant Soviet attacks in brutal winter conditions. Artillery pounded their shrinking perimeter day and night. Unlike at Stalingrad, field commanders decided to disobey Hitler's stand-fast order. On the night of February 16th, they attempted a desperate breakout through Soviet lines. What followed was carnage. Men struggled through snow and mud, abandoning their heavy equipment, fighting hand-to-hand with Soviet troops. Of the 60,000 trapped, approximately 35,000 made it through to German lines, leaving behind 20,000 dead and their wounded. It was a last stand that refused to accept its fate, a rebellion against the doctrine of death that had consumed the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. January to May 1945. As Soviet armies swept into Germany, the city of Breslau, now Wrocław, Poland, was declared a fortress city, a Festung. Its garrison of 40,000 German troops and 200,000 civilians were ordered to hold at all costs. What followed was one of the longest sieges of World War II in Europe, 82 days of relentless combat. The defenders transformed every building into a fortress, every street into a killing zone. Soviet artillery reduced the beautiful Baroque city to rubble, block by block. Civilians were pressed into service-building defences, often under fire. The garrison commander, General Hermann Niehoff, maintained fanatical discipline, executing soldiers and civilians accused of defeatism. Food ran out, people starved. By the time Breslau surrendered on May 6, 1945, 2 days before Germany's official surrender, the city was a wasteland. Over 6,000 German soldiers and 170,000 civilians had died. The last stand at Breslau achieved nothing strategically, but demonstrated the horrific cost of Hitler's fortress doctrine. April 1945, East Prussia. Königsberg, the historical capital of East Prussia and birthplace of philosopher Immanuel Kant, had become another of Hitler's fortress cities. A garrison of 130,000 German troops, commanded by General Otto Lasch, along with countless civilians, found themselves surrounded by Soviet forces. The city's medieval fortifications and modern concrete bunkers created a defensive nightmare for attackers. On April 6th, the Soviets launched their final assault with overwhelming force. 2,000 artillery pieces began a bombardment that lasted for days. The defenders fought from the ruins, from cellars and sewers, making the Soviets pay for every street. But the outcome was never in doubt. By April 9th, General Lasch, facing total annihilation and the death of countless civilians, surrendered despite Hitler's orders. Hitler immediately sentenced him to death in absentia and ordered his family arrested. Königsberg's last stand ended with 42,000 German soldiers dead and over 90,000 captured. The city would be renamed Kaliningrad and remain Soviet territory. October 1944 to May 1945, Latvia. In one of the war's strangest last stands, Army Group North, approximately 200,000 German soldiers, was cut off in the Courland Peninsula on the Baltic coast. Unlike other encirclements, the Courland Pocket had access to the sea, allowing the Kriegsmarine to supply it and even evacuate wounded. Hitler ordered these forces to hold their ground to protect German submarine bases and tie down Soviet divisions. For 7 months they fought off 6 major Soviet offensives, repelling each attack with heavy casualties on both sides. These were well-equipped, experienced troops fighting from prepared defenses, and they held. But they were soldiers locked in a prison of their own making, fighting a war that was already lost. While they held Courland, Soviet armies took Berlin. These men could have been evacuated, could have defended Germany itself, but instead they remained isolated, following orders, fighting to the last. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Courland army finally laid down its weapons. They had fought their last stand for nothing. 188,000 marched into Soviet captivity, and few ever came home. December 1944 to February 1945. Budapest, the beautiful capital of Hungary on the Danube, became the site of one of the bloodiest urban battles of World War II. Soviet forces encircled a garrison of 70,000 German and Hungarian troops plus civilians. Hitler ordered Budapest defended at all costs, declaring it another fortress city. For 50 days the defenders fought from building to building, across the bridges, through the sewers. The Buda Castle became a command fortress, the Margaret Island a killing ground. Soviet artillery and air attacks reduced much of the city to ruins. Attempts to relieve the siege failed catastrophically. By February, with ammunition and food exhausted, the garrison commander, SS Obergruppenführer Karl Pfeffer-Wildenbruch, attempted a breakout. Of the 40,000 men who tried to escape through Soviet lines, fewer than 700 reached German positions. The rest were killed or captured. Budapest's last stand cost over 38,000 German and Hungarian military dead, 80,000 captured, and over 38,000 civilian deaths. The beautiful city lay in ruins, its bridges destroyed, its monuments shattered, another testament to the futility of last stands in a lost war. March 1945, East Prussia. In the final weeks of the war in the East, approximately 200,000 German soldiers and hundreds of thousands of refugees were trapped in the Heiligenbeil pocket on the Baltic coast. This wasn't just a military last stand, it was a desperate attempt to protect civilians fleeing this Soviet advance. Reports of atrocities committed by Soviet troops against German civilians created panic, and soldiers found themselves not just fighting for military objectives, but trying to hold a corridor to the sea for evacuation. The Kriegsmarine launched Operation Hannibal, the largest naval evacuation in history, attempting to ferry civilians and soldiers across the Baltic to German-held territory. Under constant Soviet artillery fire and air attack, the defenders held a shrinking perimeter, while ships loaded refugees. Between January and May 1945, over 800,000 people were evacuated by sea from East Prussia, with the Heiligenbeil defenders buying time with their lives. When the pocket finally collapsed, those who couldn't evacuate faced an uncertain fate in Soviet-occupied territory. This last stand had a purpose beyond military glory. It was a desperate humanitarian mission amid the chaos of a collapsing empire. December 1944, Belgium. During Germany's last major offensive in the West, the American 101st Airborne Division and other units, approximately 18,000 men, found themselves completely surrounded in the town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in the Ardennes. The German commander sent a formal demand for surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe's response became legendary: nuts. For a week in freezing conditions with limited ammunition and supplies, these American soldiers held against repeated German assaults by 4 divisions. They had no winter clothing, medical supplies were running low, and fog prevented air resupply or support. The defenders dug into frozen ground, fought off tanks with bazookas, and refused to yield. When German officers came under flag of truce to demand surrender, the Americans' defiant response confused the translators. Nuts meant no. On December 26th, elements of Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines, relieving Bastogne. The last stand had held. This American defiance at Bastogne helped blunt Germany's final offensive and demonstrated that the spirit of last stands wasn't limited to desperate Axis forces. It lived wherever soldiers decided that some ground was worth any cost to hold. January-February 1945, Alsace. After the failure of the Ardennes offensive, German forces west of the Rhine found themselves increasingly isolated. The Colmar pocket in Alsace held approximately 50,000 German troops who had been ordered to hold this bridgehead on the Rhine's western bank. Rather than retreating across the river, these forces were commanded to tie down Allied troops and threaten the Allied flank. The French First Army, supported by American divisions, launched an offensive to reduce the pocket. What followed was brutal winter warfare in villages, forests, and frozen fields. German troops, many veterans of the Eastern Front, fought with characteristic determination, conducting an organized defense that made the Allies pay for every kilometer. Unlike the desperate last stands in the east, this was a professional military holding action, but it was still a last stand. By February 9th, with losses mounting and the pocket collapsing, the Germans withdrew across the Rhine. They had bought time, 3 weeks of it, but at the cost of 22,000 casualties. The Colmar pocket showed that even in the war's final months, well-led defensive forces could extract a heavy price from attackers, even in a losing cause. April 1945, Western Germany. As Allied forces advanced into the heart of Germany, they encircled Army Group B in the Ruhr industrial region. Over 300,000 German soldiers trapped in a pocket 100 kilometers across. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most capable defensive commanders, led these forces. Unlike fortress cities on the Eastern Front, the Ruhr pocket was Germany's industrial heartland: coal mines, steel mills, arms factories. Model organized a defense, but many of his troops were demoralized. They knew the war was lost. Hitler ordered the Ruhr held indefinitely, but Model faced reality. For 2 weeks, American forces compressed the pocket, fighting through industrial towns and cities. German resistance varied. Some units fought fanatically, others surrendered readily. Model's situation was impossible. On April 15th, he dissolved his command, allowing his soldiers to attempt to escape or surrender as they chose. 2 days later, Model took his own life rather than surrender. The Ruhr pocket yielded 325,000 prisoners, Germany's largest surrender in the West. It was a last stand that its commander couldn't order his men to fulfill. Recognition that sometimes the most humane decision is to acknowledge defeat rather than demand pointless sacrifice. September 1944 to May 1945, Atlantic coast of France. While most of France was liberated in summer 1944, German garrisons in the Atlantic port fortresses of Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, and others remained surrounded but undefeated. These were the U-boat bases protected by massive concrete bunkers and fortifications. Hitler ordered them held to the end. Approximately 125,000 German troops garrisoned these fortresses while the war moved hundreds of kilometers to the east. The Allies, primarily French forces, besieged them but never launched full-scale assaults. The casualties would have been too high and the strategic value too low. For 8 to 9 months, these German garrisons sat in their fortresses, supplied by sea and then, not at all, isolated from the rest of the war. They conducted small-scale combat with Free French forces, maintained discipline, and waited. It was a strange last stand, not a desperate battle, but a lonely vigil. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, these garrisons finally emerged and laid down their weapons. They had tied down Allied forces, but they had also imprisoned themselves, spending the final year of the war in military limbo, defenders of fortresses that no longer mattered. 1944 to 1945, Channel Islands. The only British territory occupied by Nazi Germany, the Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney and Sark, remained under German control throughout the war. By 1944, approximately 25,000 German soldiers were stationed there, having transformed the islands into heavily fortified positions as part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. When D-Day came, the Allies bypassed the islands entirely. They had no strategic value. For 11 months after France's liberation, these German garrisons remained isolated, their supply lines severed. Food became scarce. Both the German soldiers and the British civilian population they occupied began to starve. Red Cross parcels provided the only relief. The garrison commander, Vice Admiral Friedrich Hofmeier, maintained strict discipline and Nazi ideology, conducting military exercises and enforcing regulations as if the war could still be won. It was an absurdist last stand. Armed forces preparing to defend islands no one was attacking, maintaining military readiness for a non-existent threat. On May 9, 1945, the day after Germany's surrender, British forces arrived and accepted the garrison's capitulation. The soldiers had maintained their positions to the end, the last piece of British territory freed from Nazi occupation, defenders of islands that had become a prison for both occupier and occupied. September 1944 to May 1945, northern France. While Dunkirk is famous for the 1940 British evacuation, few remember that a German garrison remained in Dunkirk for 9 months after Allied forces swept past it. Approximately 10,000 German troops under Admiral Friedrich Frisius held the port fortress while the war moved into Germany itself. Czech and French forces besieged the garrison, conducting artillery exchanges and small raids, but never mounted a full assault. The Germans, well supplied initially and then surviving on reduced rations, maintained their defense. They conducted aggressive patrolling, laid extensive minefields, and turned the port area into a fortress zone. For these soldiers, it was a peculiar existence, fighting a small localized war while the Third Reich collapsed hundreds of kilometers away. They listened to BBC broadcasts reporting German defeats, yet they maintained their positions. When Germany surrendered on May 8th, Frisius initially considered continuing resistance, but realized the futility. On May 9th, he formally surrendered. The garrison had suffered about 300 dead during the siege. They had defended Dunkirk longer than France had defended France in 1940. A footnote: last stand in a war full of them. 1944 to 1945, Crete. After conquering the island in 1941's costly airborne invasion, Germany maintained a garrison of over 11,000 troops on Crete. By 1944, as the Allies advanced through Italy and prepared to invade Greece, Crete's garrison found itself increasingly isolated. Hitler declared Crete a fortress to be held at all costs. Its position in the eastern Mediterranean made it strategically valuable. The garrison commander, General Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, had earned the nickname Butcher of Crete for brutal anti-partisan operations. The garrison fought not just potential Allied invasion, but a fierce Greek resistance movement. British special forces conducted raids, Greek partisans harassed German positions, and naval supply lines became increasingly dangerous. Yet the Germans held Crete through Greece's liberation, through Italy's surrender, through Germany's eastern collapse. They maintained discipline, conserved supplies, and prepared for an invasion that never came. By May 1945, they were completely isolated, their supply situation desperate. On May 9th, after Germany's surrender, they finally capitulated. Over 3 years after conquering Crete, at terrible cost, the survivors finally left an island they had held until the absolute end. 1944 to 1945, northern Italy. The Gothic Line was Germany's last major defensive position in Italy, stretching across the Apennine Mountains from the Ligurian Sea to the Adriatic. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had transformed the mountains into a fortress zone of bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions. Approximately 500,000 German and Italian Social Republic troops defended this line against Allied attacks. From August 1944 through April 1945, some of the most brutal mountain warfare of World War I raged here. German troops, many veterans of Eastern Front battles, conducted a masterful defensive campaign, making the Allies pay for every mountain peak, every valley, every fortified village. Units cut off in mountain positions would fight to the last, knowing retreat was often impossible. The 10th Mountain Division and British forces attacked uphill against prepared positions in rain, snow and fog. German defenders used every advantage of terrain, conducting local counterattacks and holding positions until overrun. By April 1945, Allied forces finally broke through, but German units continued fighting until Italy's formal surrender on May 2nd. The Gothic Line last stands were a campaign of small unit actions, companies and battalions holding mountain positions until surrounded, then fighting to the end or attempting desperate breakouts. May 1943, Tunisia. Rommel's Afrika Korps and Italian forces, over 250,000 men, were trapped in Tunisia after defeats at El Alamein, and the Allied Operation Torch landings Hitler ordered Tunisia defended at all costs, pouring reinforcements into what was becoming an African Stalingrad. By May, surrounded by British, American, and Free French forces, with air and sea supply lines severed, the situation was hopeless. German and Italian troops defended a shrinking perimeter around Tunis and Bizerte. Many were veterans who had fought across North Africa's deserts for years. Now they made their last stand in Tunisia's hills. Unlike the Eastern Front, officers here recognized reality. On May 12, 1943, after a final Allied offensive, Axis forces surrendered en masse, over 275,000 prisoners, including almost all the Afrika Korps. Hitler was furious at what he saw as surrender rather than a fight to the death, but field commanders had chosen their soldiers' survival over futile sacrifice. The Tunisia last stand ended not with the dramatic annihilation of Stalingrad, but with a pragmatic recognition that sometimes survival is the victory. These prisoners of war would spend the rest of the war in Allied camps, alive. A different outcome than awaited those who fought to the literal end on other fronts. July-August 1943, Sicily. When Allied forces invaded Sicily, approximately 60,000 German and 195,000 Italian troops defended the island. As the Allied advance gained momentum and Italian resistance collapsed, the German WWII Panzer Corps conducted a fighting withdrawal to the northeast corner of Sicily. Their mission? Hold a defensive line long enough to evacuate Axis forces across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy. For 2 weeks, German units conducted a textbook defensive action, holding positions until pressure became overwhelming, then withdrawing to the next defensive line. They used demolitions, mines, and expert rearguard tactics to delay Allied pursuit. Italian troops, many demoralized, still fought in sectors to allow evacuation. From August 11th, 17, under constant Allied air attack, the Kriegsmarine and Italian Navy evacuated over 100,000 troops and 10,000 vehicles and equipment across the strait. German anti-aircraft batteries and fighters provided cover. The last troops left Sicily on August 17th, having conducted one of the war's most successful defensive evacuations. This wasn't a fight to annihilation, it was a last stand with an exit strategy. Soldiers buying time for their comrades to escape, professional military skill allowing strategic withdrawal rather than pointless sacrifice. January-May 1944, Italy. The ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, perched on a mountain overlooking the Liri Valley, became one of World War II's most contested positions. German paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division turned the mountain and surrounding hills into a fortress. For 4 months, Allied forces, American, British, New Zealand, Indian, Polish and Free French, launched repeated assaults against German positions. The Germans held with remarkable tenacity. Even after Allied bombers reduced the monastery to rubble, paratroopers fighting from the ruins repelled attack after attack. Each position was defended to the last, with small groups of German soldiers holding bunkers and cellars against overwhelming odds. Individual companies would hold positions for weeks under constant artillery bombardment. The Polish Second Corps finally captured the monastery ruins in May 1944, finding only wounded German defenders who had fought until they physically couldn't continue. Monte Cassino represented last-stand warfare at its most intense. Small unit actions where squads and platoons decided that their few meters of rubble would not be yielded without the ultimate price. February-March 1945, Iwo Jima. On this tiny volcanic island, 22,000 Japanese soldiers under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi prepared the ultimate last stand. They had no illusions. There would be no reinforcement, no evacuation, no hope of victory. Their mission was simple: kill as many Americans as possible before dying. Kuribayashi revolutionized Japanese defensive tactics, abandoning suicidal beach charges for a defense in depth. His men carved 18 kilometers of tunnels through volcanic rock, creating an underground fortress with interlocking fields of fire. Every cave, every bunker was positioned to require assault by flamethrowers and demolitions. When Marines landed on February 19th, they expected the battle to last 5 days. It lasted 36. Japanese soldiers fought from positions that had to be destroyed individually. They conducted no banzai charges, just disciplined, deadly defense. Of 22,000 defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died in their positions, fighting to the last bullet as ordered. Iwo Jima's last stand cost the Marines 6,821 dead and 19,217 wounded. The only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese. Kuribayashi's defense demonstrated that a last stand, properly conducted, could achieve strategic effect. The horrific casualties influenced American planning for the invasion of Japan itself. April-June 1945, Okinawa. The largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War landed on an island defended by 110,000 Japanese troops. General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded a defense that would be Japan's last major ground battle. The Japanese had learned from previous defeats: no water's edge defense, no banzai charges. Instead, they created defense zones in southern Okinawa's hills and caves, centered on the Shuri Line. For 3 months, American forces faced a last stand that cost them 12,000 dead and 50,000 wounded. The Japanese fought from fortified caves and pillboxes, each requiring assault by flamethrowers, satchel charges, and tanks. They conducted night infiltration attacks, used kamikaze aircraft against the naval fleet, and made every yard cost American lives. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Over 100,000 died. By June, compressed into the island's southern tip, Japanese soldiers still refused surrender. Ushijima and his staff committed ritual suicide on June 22nd, the formal end of organized resistance. Of 110,000 defenders, only 7,400 were captured. The rest died fighting or by suicide. Okinawa's last stand killed more Americans than any other Pacific battle, and demonstrated what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost. June-July 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. When American forces invaded Saipan, they faced 31,000 Japanese defenders and encountered a horror they hadn't witnessed before: civilians choosing death over surrender. The Japanese military had indoctrinated both soldiers and the island's Japanese civilian population that Americans would torture and murder prisoners. As American forces advanced, Japanese troops conducted a disciplined defense, but the outcome was never in doubt. On July 7th, with the battle nearly lost, the remaining 3,000 Japanese soldiers launched one of the war's largest banzai charges. Not a tactical move, but a death charge. Men determined to die fighting rather than surrender. They attacked with rifles, swords, and bayonets, overrunning American positions before being cut down. The charge ended Japanese organized resistance. What followed shocked American troops. At cliffs on the island's northern end, Japanese soldiers and civilians, women, children, committed mass suicide, jumping to their deaths rather than surrender. Loudspeakers broadcasting surrender appeals in Japanese failed to stop them. Of 31,000 Japanese military on Saipan, only 921 were captured alive. The rest died in combat or by suicide. Saipan demonstrated that last stands in the Pacific weren't just military affairs. They were cultural clashes where the concept of surrender didn't exist. September, November 1944, Peleliu. On this tiny coral island, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded 11,000 Japanese soldiers who had created a defensive masterpiece in the Umabrogal Mountain, the Bloody Nose Ridge. Like at Iwo Jima, they fought from caves and tunnels, each position requiring individual assault. The Marines expected to take Peleliu in 4 days. It took 73. The Japanese had fortified over 500 caves in the coral limestone, creating positions that connected through tunnels, allowing defenders to reoccupy positions the Americans thought cleared. Marines assaulted the same hills repeatedly, each time facing deadly fire from invisible defenders. Japanese soldiers fought with discipline, conserving ammunition, targeting officers and corpsmen, making every shot count. They endured flamethrowers, napalm, and constant bombardment. Of 11,000 defenders, only 202 were captured alive, most wounded and unconscious. The rest died in their caves or committed suicide. Nakagawa conducted the defense until November 24th and burned his regiment's colors and committed ritual suicide with his remaining officers. The battle for Peleliu cost the Marines 1,800 dead and 8,000 wounded, for an island of questionable strategic value, a last stand that achieved its purpose, inflicting maximum casualties. December 1941, Wake Island. Just days after Pearl Harbor, this tiny Pacific atoll, with its garrison of 450 Marines and 1,150 civilian contractors, faced Japanese invasion. For 2 weeks, outnumbered and outgunned, these defenders conducted America's first last stand of the Pacific War. On December 11th, they repelled the first Japanese invasion attempt, sinking 2 destroyers and damaging other ships, the only time in the war that coastal defense guns alone defeated an amphibious assault. The defenders shot down 72 Japanese aircraft with their limited fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The Navy promised relief that never came. On December 23rd, after sustained bombardment and a massive second invasion force, Japanese troops landed. The Marines fought building by building, position by position, but with ammunition exhausted and hundreds of casualties. Commander Winfield Cunningham surrendered to prevent the massacre of wounded and civilians. The garrison had killed 820 Japanese troops and destroyed significant naval and air assets. Of the defenders, 49 Marines died in battle. Later, 98 civilian contractors left on the island were executed by the Japanese. The Wake Island garrison became heroes. Their last stand, though ending in defeat, provided America with a desperately needed symbol of resistance in the dark early days of the war. January-May 1942, Corregidor Island, Philippines. After Bataan fell, approximately 13,000 American and Filipino troops withdrew to the fortified island of Corregidor at Manila Bay's entrance. For a month, they endured constant Japanese artillery bombardment and air attacks. The defenders fought from the island's coastal artillery batteries and the Malinta tunnel complex carved into solid rock. General Jonathan Wainwright commanded forces that knew no relief was possible. The Philippines had been written off, the Pacific Fleet destroyed at Pearl Harbor. They were alone. Japanese artillery, positioned on the Bataan Peninsula, pounded Corregidor with over 600 guns. Dive bombers attacked constantly. The island's vegetation was stripped away, concrete fortifications cratered, yet the defenders held. On May 5th, Japanese forces landed under cover of intense bombardment. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted on the beaches and in the tunnels. With water supplies contaminated, ammunition running low, and Japanese troops threatening to use explosives to seal the Malinta tunnel with thousands of wounded inside, Wainwright made the agonizing decision to surrender on May 6, 1942. The Corregidor garrison had delayed the Japanese timetable by months. These men became prisoners who would endure 3 years of brutal captivity, but their last stand remained a symbol of American-Filipino resistance. February-March 1945, Manila, Philippines. As American forces advanced to liberate the Philippines, the Japanese garrison of 16,000 naval troops in Manila, commanded by Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, refused to evacuate. Against orders from higher command, Iwabuchi decided to defend the city to the death. What followed was one of the war's most destructive urban battles, and one of its greatest tragedies. Japanese forces turned Manila into a fortress, fortifying buildings, laying minefields, and preparing for a last stand that would cost over 100,000 civilian lives. They conducted a campaign of atrocities against Filipino civilians, massacring entire neighborhoods. American and Filipino forces fought building by building through the city for a month. Artillery and airstrikes reduced centuries-old architecture to rubble. The Japanese defenders retreated into the Intramuros, Manila's ancient walled city, where they made their final stand. Every building became a fortress, every street a killing zone. By March 3rd, after intense fighting, the last Japanese position fell. Of 16,000 defenders, only a handful survived. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, was devastated. 80% of the city destroyed, second only to Warsaw in destruction among Allied capitals. Iwabuchi's last stand had no strategic purpose. It was destruction for its own sake, a senseless tragedy that demonstrated how last stands, when divorced from military necessity, become simply massacres. April-May 1945, Berlin. The ultimate last stand of World War II occurred in the ruins of Nazi Germany's capital. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers surrounded a city defended by a makeshift garrison of Wehrmacht remnants, Waffen-SS units, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth, perhaps 90,000 combat-capable troops. Hitler refused to evacuate, ordering the city defended to the last. For 2 weeks, street by street and building by building, the Soviets advanced against fanatical and desperate resistance. German defenders, some as young as 12 years old, fought with Panzerfausts against Soviet tanks. SS units executed soldiers found retreating. The Führerbunker, Hitler's underground command post, became the center of a shrinking Reich that existed only in his mind. Above ground, Berlin burned. Soviet artillery reduced the city to rubble, while soldiers fought in sewers and subway tunnels. On April 30th, with Soviet troops blocks away, Hitler committed suicide. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. Over 22,000 German soldiers died in the battle. Soviet casualties exceeded 80,000 dead. The Berlin last stand was Nazi Germany's death rattle, a futile, destructive end to a regime that had brought the world to ruin. Those who fought to the end died defending nothing but the corpse of a dream built on evil. April 1945, beneath Berlin. In the last days of the war, Hitler's headquarters moved into the Führerbunker, a concrete shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden. Here, 15 meters underground, the last defenders of Nazi ideology maintained a delusional command structure. Hitler, surrounded by his closest associates, continued to issue orders to armies that no longer existed, planning offensives with divisions that had been destroyed. In this claustrophobic concrete tomb, about 40 people conducted the final chapter of the Third Reich. Eva Braun joined Hitler to die with him. Joseph Goebbels brought his family to this bunker of death. Military conferences discussed phantom reinforcements. Hitler Youth defenders were sent to die against Soviet tanks. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun. On April 30th, they committed suicide together. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery Garden. Goebbels became Chancellor for one day before poisoning his 6 children and committing suicide with his wife. The bunker's remaining occupants attempted to break through Soviet lines. Most were captured or killed. The Führer bunker last stand wasn't a battle. It was a suicide cult's final act, the command structure of a criminal regime choosing death over accountability. The last stand units of World War II represent the full spectrum of human courage, desperation, and tragedy. Some, like the defenders of Bastogne, held ground that mattered and contributed to victory. Others, like the soldiers of Stalingrad and Courland, fought and died in service of a lost cause, ordered to stand where they should have withdrawn. In the Pacific, Japanese defenders demonstrated that culture and ideology could transform last stands from military tactics into suicide missions that killed soldiers and civilians alike. The question remains, when does a last stand represent their valor? And when does it become pointless sacrifice? The soldiers who fought these battles didn't always have the luxury of choosing. They followed orders, honored their oaths, and stood by their comrades even when all hope was gone. Some fought for evil causes, others defended their homelands or bought time for civilians to escape. What unites them all is the extraordinary circumstance of being asked to fight, with no hope of victory, supply, or reinforcement, to stand and fight until there was nothing left to fight with. World War II's last stands killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, destroyed cities and cultures, and achieved outcomes ranging from strategically important to utterly meaningless. They remind us that courage exists even in hopeless situations, but also that sometimes the greatest courage is recognizing when a battle cannot be won and choosing survival over sacrifice. These were men who fought until the final bullet and then beyond. We remember them not just as warriors, but as human beings caught in impossible circumstances, doing what they believed was their duty. Their last stands echo through history, testaments to endurance, warnings about futility, and eternal questions about the price of honor.